Imagine waking up one morning to find a notice taped to your front door declaring that your private home is now a community resource. That's exactly what happened to me when our power-hungry HOA president decided my family's sanctuary would become the neighborhood's new gathering space. But what they didn't expect was that they picked the wrong homeowner to mess with. This is the story of how I fought back against overreach and won, not just for myself, but for every homeowner who's ever felt powerless against their HOA. If you've ever dealt with unreasonable HOA demands, hit that subscribe button and stick around to see how one homeowner took on the system and came out victorious. Pine Valley Estates was everything my family and I had dreamed of when we purchased our home 5 years ago. As I stood in my backyard, that crisp September morning, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I couldn't help but feel grateful. Our 2-story Colonial, with its wraparound porch and meticulously maintained garden, had been worth every penny of our life savings. My name is Daniel Miller, Dan to my friends, and this home represented everything my wife Laura and I had worked for. The spacious backyard where our son Ryan practiced soccer, the cozy home office where Laura ran her growing online business, and the garden that had become my weekend sanctuary. It was our slice of the American dream. We'd chosen Pine Valley Estate specifically for its reputation as a well-maintained community. Yes, there was an HOA, and their rules could be a bit stringent at times. The quarterly dues were steep, but the pristine common areas, well-lit streets, and general sense of order made it seem worthwhile. Laura often joked that I was the only person she knew who actually read the entire HOA guidelines manual cover to cover when we moved in. But that's just who I am. I like to know exactly what I'm getting into. Our home had become something of a neighborhood gem, I'll admit. Laura's eye for design and my dedication to maintenance had transformed it from a standard Colonial into something special. The previous owners had let it fall into disrepair, but we'd restored every inch of it, from the original hardwood floors to the vintage crown molding. The wraparound porch with its comfortable seating area and Laura's flourishing container. Gardens had become my favorite spot to unwind after long days at the architectural firm where I worked. That particular morning started like any other. I was enjoying my usual pre-work routine, walking the perimeter of our property with my coffee, mentally noting weekend maintenance tasks. Our next-door neighbors, Chris and Amy Parker, waved as they left for their morning jog. Peggy Walsh, the sweet elderly lady across the street, was already out tending to her prized roses. It was the kind of peaceful morning that made all the HOA regulations and fees seem like a small price to pay for such a perfect slice of suburban life. I noticed Victoria Thompson, our HOA president, power walking past our house, tablet in hand, probably on another one of her community inspection rounds. She'd taken over as president 6 months ago, and already there had been whispers about her increasingly aggressive enforcement of HOA regulations. Just last week, the Martinez's 2 doors down had received a violation notice because their garbage bins were visible from the street for an extra hour after collection, on the day their youngest had been homesick with the flu. But I wasn't particularly worried. Our property was always immaculate, and I made sure we followed every regulation to the letter. The garden beds were exactly the approved dimensions. Our house paint was from the sanctioned color palette, and even our mailbox matched the community-mandated design. We were model residents by any measure. I headed inside to get ready for work, pausing in the kitchen to kiss Laura goodbye as she prepared Ryan's lunch for school. Our morning routine was down to a science. Laura managing the household schedule on her laptop, while simultaneously making sure Ryan had everything he needed for his classes, me gathering my materials for client meetings, and Ryan rushing around looking for his perpetually missing soccer cleats. "Dad, can we set up the net in the backyard this weekend?" Ryan asked, finally locating his cleats under the kitchen table. Coach says I need to work on my penalty kicks. Sure, buddy, I replied, straightening his collar. Just remember to take it down afterward. You know how the HOA feels about temporary structures. I made air quotes, and Laura rolled her eyes good-naturedly. Speaking of the HOA, Laura said, sliding a piece of paper across the kitchen island, did you see this newsletter? They're planning some kind of community enhancement initiative. There's a meeting about it next week. I glanced at the newsletter, noting the vague language about maximizing community resources and enhancing shared spaces. Typical HOA jargon that could mean anything from planting new flowers in the common areas to raising our dues for the third time this year. I'll try to make it, I said, checking my watch, but I have that big client presentation next week. You know how it is with the Anderson project. Little did I know that missing that meeting would set in motion a chain of events that would turn our peaceful suburban life upside down. If I'd paid more attention to the subtle signs, Victoria's lingering glances at our property during her morning walks, the sudden interest from the HOA board in our home's historical significance to the community, the casual questions about our renovation process during the last neighborhood barbecue, maybe I would have seen it coming. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. And I had no way of knowing that in less than 24 hours, that piece of paper taped to our front door would shatter our family's sense of security and launch us into a battle that would test not just our resolve, but the very meaning of home ownership in Pine Valley Estates. The morning everything changed started with a pounding on our front door. It was barely 7 a.m. and I was still in my bathrobe, coffee mug in hand, when I opened the door to find Victoria Thompson standing there with two other HOA board members, Richard Anderson and Barbara Wilson. Their presence at this hour was unusual enough, but it was their expressions, a mixture of faux concern and barely concealed satisfaction, that made my stomach drop. "Good morning, Daniel," Victoria said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We need to discuss some exciting community developments that directly involve your property." Before I could respond, she thrust a thick envelope into my hands and continued, "The board has unanimously voted to designate your home as a community historical and cultural resource under Section 7.3 of the updated HOA bylaws. Isn't that wonderful?" I stared at the envelope, then back at Victoria, my mind struggling to process what she was saying. "I'm sorry. What?" "Your home has been selected to serve as our neighborhood's first community resource center," Richard chimed, in his clipboard at the ready. "Given its historical significance and central location, it's perfect for community gatherings, HOA meetings, and cultural events." Laura appeared behind me, still in her pajamas, likely drawn by the commotion. "What's going on?" Barbara Wilson, who had always reminded me of a stern librarian, pushed her glasses up her nose and began reading from an official-looking document. As per the new Community Enhancement Initiative approved at last week's emergency board meeting, selected properties may be designated for community use when deemed beneficial to the neighborhood as a whole. My coffee had gone cold in my hand. As the reality of what they were saying began to sink in, are you suggesting that our private home, our property that we bought and paid for, is going to be used for community events? "Oh, don't worry about the details," Victoria waved her hand dismissively. "You'll be compensated with a reduction in your HOA dues, and of course you'll have priority scheduling for your own family events. We'll only need access to your first floor and backyard for community functions. The upper floor will remain private, except during the annual holiday home tour, naturally." Laura's hand gripped my arm tightly. "This can't be legal," she whispered. "I understand this might seem overwhelming," Victoria continued, either ignoring or oblivious to our growing horror. "But think of the honor. Your home will be the centerpiece of our community's social life. We're already planning the first event. Next month's HOA quarterly meeting will be held in your living room. We expect about 50 attendees. I felt my face growing hot. We never agreed to this. We weren't even consulted. The notification was in last week's newsletter, Barbara interjected. The one announcing the Community Enhancement Initiative. All homeowners were invited to attend the emergency board meeting where this was discussed and approved. That newsletter said nothing about designating private homes as community spaces, I argued, my voice rising. And an emergency board meeting with less than a week's notice scheduled during business hours. That's hardly proper notification. Victoria's smile tightened. Everything was done according to procedure, I assure you. In the envelope, you'll find the complete documentation, including the new bylaw amendments and the schedule of upcoming community events. We'll need a key to your home by the end of the week. A key to our absolutely not, Laura stepped forward, her usual calm demeanor giving way to anger.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
This is our private home, not a community center. Mrs. Miller, Victoria's tone turned cold. I understand this is a lot to process, but the decision has been made. Failure to comply with HOA directives can result in significant fines, liens on your property, and other enforcement actions. I suggest you review the documentation and come to terms with your home's new prestigious status in our community. Ryan appeared at the top of the stairs, still in his pajamas. Mom? Dad? What's going on? Nothing, honey, Laura called up, her voice strained. Get ready for school. I held up my hand, stopping Victoria before she could continue. We'll review these documents with our lawyer. Don't expect any keys and don't make any plans for using our home. Now, if you'll excuse us, we need to get our son ready for school. Victoria's smile returned, but it didn't reach her eyes. Of course. Take time to process this wonderful news. But do remember, you have until the end of the week to provide access arrangements, or we'll be forced to take administrative action. Have a lovely day. As they turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of our neighbors peering out their windows, no doubt wondering about the early morning confrontation on our doorstep. Chris Parker was standing in his driveway, coffee cup, frozen halfway to his mouth, watching the scene unfold. I closed the door and leaned against it, the thick envelope heavy in my hands. Laura grabbed it from me and began pulling out documents, her hands shaking slightly as she spread them across our kitchen island. They can't do this, she said, scanning the papers. They can't just declare our private home a community space. This is insane. I picked up one of the documents, a detailed schedule of planned community events for the next 6 months, all set to take place in our home, book club meetings in our living room, HOA board meetings in our dining room, garden, club gatherings in our backyard, holiday parties, community workshops, even a weekly morning coffee meetup on our front porch. Dad? Ryan had come downstairs looking worried. Are we losing our house? No, buddy, I assured him, though my own confidence was shaken. We're not losing anything. This is our home and it's going to stay that way. Laura was already on her phone typing frantically. I'm looking up property lawyers. This has to be illegal. They can't just commandeer our private property like this. I nodded, my initial shock giving way to determination. Get us the earliest appointment you can find and forward me those documents. I'm going to read every single word of this so-called bylaw amendment. They might think they can bully us into submission, but they have no idea who they're dealing with. As I headed upstairs to get dressed for work, my mind was already racing with next steps. I needed to understand exactly what we were up against, gather evidence and build a case. Victoria Thompson and her board might think they had all the power, but I wasn't about to let them turn our private home into their personal community center without a fight. Looking out our bedroom window, I could see Victoria and her cronies making their way down the street, stopping to chat with other neighbors, no doubt spreading their twisted version of events. This wasn't just about protecting our home anymore. This was about standing up to a clear abuse of power, and I was going to make sure they regretted ever targeting our family. Little did they know, they had just awakened a side of me that wouldn't rest until justice was served, no matter how long or hard the fight ahead might be. The rest of that morning passed in a blur. I called into work, explaining I had a family emergency, and Laura rescheduled her client meetings. We needed to understand exactly what we were dealing with. Our dining room table quickly transformed into a war room, covered with HOA documents, bylaws, and our property deed. "Look at this," Laura said, highlighting a section of the new bylaws. "They've added an entirely new section about community resource designation that wasn't in the original guidelines. According to this, they can designate any property for community enrichment purposes if it meets certain criteria." I leaned over her shoulder, scanning the document. "What criteria?" "That's the thing. It's incredibly vague. Historical, significance, architectural merit, cultural value, optimal location for community gatherings. They've written it so broadly that they could potentially justify targeting any home in the neighborhood." My blood pressure rose as I read through the supposed compensation package they were offering, a 25% reduction in monthly HOA dues in exchange for surrendering our privacy and control over our own home. It was insulting. "Dad?" Ryan stood in the doorway, backpack in hand. "I'm going to be late for school." I checked my watch and cursed under my breath. In all the chaos, we'd lost track of time. "I'll drive you, buddy. Laura, can you keep digging while I'm gone?" She nodded, already on the phone with what seemed to be another law office. "Yes." "It's urgent." "No, we need someone who specializes in HOA law. Today, if possible." The drive to Ryan's school was tense. I could tell he was worried, but trying to be brave about it. "Are we going to have to move?" he asked quietly as we pulled up to the school. "No, Ryan. This is our home, and we're going to fight for it. I promise you that." After dropping him off, I made a detour to the county records office. If the HOA wanted to play the historical significance card, I needed to know exactly what history they were claiming. The clerk at the records office, an older gentleman named Frank, was surprisingly helpful once I explained my situation. "Pine Valley Estates?" He raised an eyebrow. "That whole development was farmland until 1985. Your house was built in 1987. There's nothing historically significant about it, at least not in any official capacity." I left with copies of every document related to our property and the development of Pine Valley Estates. The HOA's claims about historical significance were starting to look more and more like a convenient fiction. Returning home, I found Laura in an animated conversation with someone on speakerphone. "Yes, Mr. Stevens, that's exactly what they're claiming." "No, we never received any formal notice about this new bylaw." "Yes, we still have the original HOA agreement from when we purchased the house." Mark Stevens, it turned out, was a lawyer who specialized in property rights and HOA disputes. Unlike the other attorneys we'd called, he seemed genuinely outraged by our situation. "This is one of the most egregious overreaches I've seen," he said, his voice clear through the speaker. "They can't simply declare private property a community. Resource without proper notification, homeowner consent, and legal documentation. When can you come to my office?" We scheduled a meeting for that afternoon. While Laura continued sorting through documents, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood. I needed to understand if we were truly alone in this fight. Our next-door neighbor, Chris Parker, was in his driveway washing his car. He waved me over as soon as he saw me. "Dan, what happened this morning?" "Victoria's been going around telling everyone your house is going to be the new community center or something." I explained the situation, watching his expression shift. From confusion to disbelief to anger. They can't do that, he said, shaking his head. Amy and I were at that so-called emergency meeting last week. They never mentioned anything about taking over private homes. They talked about community enhancement and resource optimization, but it was all vague corporate speak. Were there many people at the meeting? Maybe 10 residents? Tops. It was at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. Most people were at work. This was valuable information. As we talked, Peggy Walsh shuffled over from across the street, her face etched with concern. "Daniel, dear," she said, patting my arm, "I just heard what those awful people are trying to do. You know, Victoria tried something similar when she was on the board of her previous HOA in Riverdale. My sister lives there, said it was a huge scandal." My ears perked up. Previous HOA. What happened? Oh, she resigned suddenly after some controversy about misusing HOA funds. Never did hear the full story, but my sister said it was quite the mess. I made a mental note to look into Victoria's history. If there was a pattern of abuse of power, that could be useful information. Returning home, I found Laura hanging up the phone, looking more optimistic than she had all morning. "I just got off the phone with Sarah Coleman from the local paper," she said. "She's interested in doing a story about this. Apparently she's been investigating complaints about HOAs in the area, and our situation fits a pattern she's been tracking." That's good," I nodded. "The more light we shine on this, the better." We spent the next hour preparing for our meeting with Mark Stevens, gathering all our documentation into organized folders. The original HOA agreement from our home purchase, the property deed, the new bylaws they'd thrust upon us this morning, and the county records I'd obtained. Just as we were about to leave for the lawyer's office, there was another knock at our door. This time, it was Barbara Wilson, alone, clutching more paperwork. "Just dropping off the required forms for key copies and alarm codes," she said, trying to sound businesslike but avoiding eye contact. "We'll need those by Friday." "Barbara," I said, keeping my voice level, "you've been in this community longer than most. You have to see that this is wrong." She hesitated for a moment, and I caught a glimpse of uncertainty in her expression before her professional mask slipped back into place. "The board's decisions are final, Mr. Miller. It's better for everyone if you cooperate." As she turned to leave, I noticed she'd left an extra piece of paper that had fallen from her stack. It was a partial printout of email correspondence between board members discussing the Community Resource Program. One line caught my eye before Laura picked it up. "Thompson says this is just the first phase. Once we establish precedent with the Miller property." The implication was clear. We weren't just fighting for our home. We were fighting to prevent this from happening to our neighbors as well. This was bigger than us now. "Mark needs to see this," Laura said, carefully placing the email printout in our documentation folder. As we drove to the lawyer's office, I couldn't help but think about how quickly our peaceful life had been upended. But with each piece of evidence we gathered, with each supportive neighbor we spoke to, I became more certain that we weren't just going to fight this. We were going to win. What Victoria and her board didn't realize was that they hadn't just picked a fight with the Millers. They'd awakened a community's sense of justice, and that was about to become their biggest mistake. The offices of Mark Stevens and Associates occupied a modest suite in a professional building downtown. As Laura and I sat across from Mark, watching him review our documents, his frown deepened with each page he turned. He paused, removing his reading glasses. "Well, frankly, this is outrageous. Not only is their community resource designation legally dubious, but the way they've gone about implementing it violates multiple state property laws." "So they can't actually do this?" Laura asked, hope creeping into her voice. Mark leaned forward. They're counting on homeowners not knowing their rights or being too intimidated to fight back. Let's start with the obvious issues. First, their emergency board meeting wasn't properly noticed. State law requires a minimum of 2 weeks' notice for any meeting where significant bylaw changes are to be voted on. We have Chris Parker's statement about that meeting, I added. Only 10 residents were there, all during working hours. Exactly, Mark nodded. Second, any fundamental change to property rights requires a supermajority vote of all homeowners, not just board members. They can't simply declare private property a community resource through a unilateral board decision. He picked up the email printout that Barbara had dropped. And this suggests a broader conspiracy to gradually take control of multiple properties. It's a clear abuse of power. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from our neighbor Susan Chen. Victoria and Richard are at your house right now with some workers. They're trying to install a lockbox. We need to go, I said, showing Laura the text. They're at our house. Mark stood up quickly. I'm coming with you. This is exactly the kind of overreach we can use to build our case. The drive home was tense. Mark used the time to brief us on our rights and what we should and shouldn't say. As we pulled onto our street, we could see a small crowd had gathered near our house. Victoria was supervising 2 men in work uniforms who were examining our front door. Remember, Mark said as we parked, let me do most of the talking. We approached just as one of the workers was preparing to drill into our doorframe. Stop right there, I shouted, causing everyone to freeze. Victoria turned, that artificial smile plastered on her face again. Oh, Daniel, Laura, how nice of you to join us. We're just installing the community access system, nothing to worry about. Mark stepped forward, extending his business card. Mark Stevens, legal counsel for the Millers. I'm going to have to ask your workers to step away from the property immediately. Victoria's smile faltered slightly. The HOA has authority to... The HOA has no such authority, Mark interrupted firmly. You are attempting to modify private property without owner consent, which is not only a violation of HOA regulations, but also state law. I suggest you and your workers leave immediately, or we'll be forced to contact law enforcement for attempted vandalism and trespassing. Richard Anderson, who had been standing quietly to the side, stepped forward. Now, see here, we have proper documentation. Documentation that wasn't properly voted on, wasn't properly noticed, and violates multiple state property laws, Mark countered. Would you like me to enumerate them here, in front of all these witnesses? The gathered neighbors were watching intently. I noticed several people had their phones out, recording the confrontation. Victoria's composure cracked slightly. This is a board-approved initiative, which we're formally challenging, Mark stated. Until this matter is legally resolved, any attempt to modify or access the Millers' property without their express consent will result in immediate legal action. Would you like me to serve you with the initial paperwork now, or would you prefer to receive it through official channels? The workers, who had been awkwardly standing by during this exchange, started packing up their tools without waiting for further instruction. Smart guys. Victoria's face had turned an interesting shade of red. This is completely unnecessary. We're trying to improve the community. By attempting to seize private property? Laura stepped forward, her voice carrying to the gathered crowd. By holding secret meetings and passing unauthorized bylaws, by installing lockboxes on people's homes without permission. Is that your idea of community improvement? I noticed Sarah Coleman, the local reporter Laura had spoken with earlier, had arrived and was taking notes. Victoria noticed her too, and her demeanor changed instantly. There seems to be some misunderstanding, she said loudly. We'll postpone the installation pending further discussion. There's nothing to discuss, I said firmly. This is our private property. We do not consent to any modifications. We do not consent to any community use designation. and we do not consent to your attempts to seize control of our home." The crowd of neighbors had grown larger. I could hear murmurs of support and see nods of approval. "Furthermore," Mark added, "I'm serving you with official notice that any further attempts to modify or access the property will result in immediate legal action, both against the HOA as an entity and board members as individuals." "You can't threaten us," Richard sputtered. "We have the authority." "Actually, they can," came a voice from the crowd. Peter Rodriguez, who I knew was a retired judge, stepped forward. "And having reviewed their documentation, I'd say they have an extremely strong case. Victoria, I strongly suggest you and the board reconsider this entire initiative before you expose the HOA to significant legal liability." Victoria looked around, seemingly realizing she had lost control of the situation. The gathered neighbors, the reporter, the lawyer, the retired judge. This was not how she had planned this to go. "We'll be in touch through proper channels," she said stiffly, before turning on her heel and walking away. Richard hurried after her, while Barbara lingered behind, looking uncertain. "Barbara," Laura called out, "we need to talk about that email you dropped off earlier, the one about this being just the first phase." Barbara's face paled. She glanced at Victoria's retreating form, then back at us. I need to think about some things," she said quietly before hurrying away. As the crowd began to disperse, Mark turned to us. "That couldn't have gone better if we'd planned it. Their attempted forced entry and modification of your property, witnessed by neighbors and a reporter. Perfect ammunition for our case." "What's our next step?" I asked. "We file for an emergency injunction first thing tomorrow morning," he replied. "That will legally prevent them from attempting anything like this again. Then we start building our case to not only stop this community resource designation, but to challenge the entire board's authority to make these kinds of unilateral decisions." Susan Chen approached us, her phone still in hand. "I recorded the whole thing," she said. "And I've been doing some digging online about Victoria's previous HOA position. You're going to want to see what I found." Looking at our front door, where the workers had almost installed their lockbox, I felt a surge of anger mixed with determination. Victoria and her board had tried to intimidate us, to bully us into submission. Instead, they had managed to unite the neighborhood against them. This wasn't just about protecting our home anymore. It was about standing up to abuse of power and ensuring it couldn't happen to anyone else in our community. After the confrontation at our front door, our dining room transformed into an impromptu command center. Susan Chen sat at the table with her laptop open, showing us what she'd discovered about Victoria Thompson's past. "Look at this," Susan said, turning her screen toward us. 3 years ago, Victoria was president of the Riverdale Heights HOA. There were multiple complaints filed against her board for similar overreach attempts. They tried to implement a community access program that would have given the HOA board keys to every home for emergency inspections. Laura leaned in, closer. What happened? She resigned suddenly right before a scheduled audit of the HOA's finances. The whole board was replaced after they discovered. Susan clicked through a few news articles, significant discrepancies in the allocation of maintenance funds. Mark Stevens, who had stayed to review this new information, was taking detailed notes. This establishes a pattern of behavior. Were there any legal proceedings? The cases were settled out of court, Susan replied. All the documents were sealed, but I found some forum posts from Riverdale residents discussing compensation payments. I was piecing things together. So she moves to a new community, works her way onto the board, becomes president, and starts the same scheme all over again. Exactly, Susan nodded. And get this, Richard Anderson? He was on her board at Riverdale too. They came as a package deal. Mark looked up from his notes. This is excellent groundwork for our case. We need to request those sealed documents. through legal channels. Even if we can't access everything, the existence of prior settlements helps establish that they're aware their actions are legally questionable. I pulled out the email printout Barbara had dropped, reading it again with fresh eyes. They were planning to use our house as a test case. If they succeeded here, they could expand the program to other homes, Laura finished. But why? What's the real endgame? Follow the money, Mark suggested. Susan, in the Riverdale case, did you find any information about how they were planning to use the accessed properties? Susan typed rapidly. There are mentions of community events, with rental fees, optional storage solutions for HOA equipment. Wait, here's something interesting. A resident complained about being charged extra HOA fees for community resource maintenance, even though their home wasn't part of the program. Check our new HOA documents, I said to Laura. The compensation package they offered was, there anything about additional fees? Laura rifled through the papers, pulling out the relevant section. Yes, buried in the fine print. While they offer a 25% reduction in base HOA dues, there are additional maintenance and liability coverage. Fees that, she did some quick math, would actually increase our total monthly payments by almost 40%. Mark sat back, a grim smile on his face. So, that's the scheme. They take control of private properties, charge the owners extra fees for maintenance, while also collecting rental fees from community events. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood gets hit with increased dues for the community resource program. It's a money-making operation disguised as community improvement. We need to get this information to Sarah Coleman at the paper, Laura said. The community needs to know what they're really planning. Carefully, Mark cautioned. We don't want to risk any defamation claims. Let's stick to the documented facts. The improper board meeting, the unauthorized bylaw changes, the attempted forced entry today, and the existence of prior complaints at Riverdale. The reporter can do her own digging into the financial aspects. I started making a list of action items. 1. File for emergency injunction. 2. Request Riverdale case documents. 3. Analyze all financial documents from current HOA. 4. Gather statements from witnesses to today's events. 5. Review every HOA meeting minute since Victoria joined the board. We should also talk to Barbara Wilson, Laura suggested. She seemed uncomfortable with what's happening. Maybe she'd be willing to help us understand more about their plans. Good thinking, Mark agreed, but approach her carefully. We don't want to spook her if she's having second thoughts about her involvement. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from David Martinez. Emergency HOA meeting called for tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. They're trying to push through some kind of clarification to the community resource policy. They're scrambling, Mark observed. Today didn't go according to their plan, so they're trying to cover their tracks. We need to be at that meeting. It's another improper notice, Laura pointed out. Less than 24 hours notice for a morning meeting on a work day? Document everything, Mark instructed. Record the meeting if possible. The more procedural violations we can prove, the stronger our case becomes. Susan was still digging through her research. You should see some of these complaints from Riverdale. The similarities are striking. They even use the same language about community enhancement and shared resources. I started texting neighbors, making sure everyone knew about the emergency meeting and its importance. The response was immediate and encouraging. Chris Parker, we'll be there. Peggy Walsh, I'm bringing my entire bridge club. Peter Rodriguez, I'll help document any procedural violations. They're not expecting organized resistance, Mark said, reviewing our growing pile of evidence. They're used to dealing with individual homeowners who feel powerless against the HOA, but a united community with legal representation and documented evidence of their past actions, that's a different story. Laura was already drafting talking points for the meeting, focusing on the legal vulnerabilities in their plan and the questionable financial implications for the entire community. "Remember," Mark advised, "stay calm and professional tomorrow. Let them do the talking. The more they try to justify their actions, the more likely they are to say something we can use. And Barbara Wilson, watch her closely. If she's having doubts, tomorrow's meeting might be where she shows it." As our strategy session continued into the evening, I couldn't help but feel a shift in the momentum. What started as a shocking invasion of our property rights had evolved into something larger, exposing a pattern of corruption that threatened our entire community. Victoria Thompson and her board had picked the wrong house, the wrong neighborhood, and definitely the wrong family to target with their scheme. Tomorrow's meeting would be just the beginning of their reckoning. The morning of the emergency HOA meeting, Mark Stevens arrived at our house an hour early to brief us on strategy. He brought with him a stack of highlighted legal documents and a younger associate named Jennifer Wong, who specialized in real estate law. "Here's how this is going to play out," Mark said, spreading documents across our kitchen island. "They're going to try to push through these clarifications to legitimize what they've already done. Our job is to prevent that while gathering more evidence of their misconduct." Jennifer opened her laptop, pulling up relevant state statutes. "I've identified 17 distinct violations in their original community resource designation policy. Every time they try to clarify something today, they'll likely add more." The doorbell rang. It was Sarah Coleman from the local paper, looking professional in a blazer with a reporter's notebook in hand. Laura had invited her to cover the meeting. "Before we head over," Sarah said, "I wanted to share something. I've been looking into Victoria Thompson's history at Riverdale Heights. There's more to the story than what's in the public record." We gathered around as Sarah pulled out her notes. "I spoke with the former treasurer of Riverdale Heights HOA. He wouldn't go on record officially, but he confirmed that their community access program was actually a front for something bigger. They were planning to use designated homes for short-term rentals during major events in the area, with the board pocketing the profits." "That's completely illegal," Jennifer exclaimed. "HOAs can't operate commercial rental enterprises without proper licenses and unanimous homeowner approval." Mark's eyes narrowed. "Check their new budget proposals. Any line items for alternative revenue development or community space optimization?" Laura was already pulling up the documents on her tablet. "Yes, right here. They've allocated $50,000 for community space enhancement and revenue optimization starting next quarter. Seek-Sue." "Got it," Mark nodded. "They're following the same playbook. Ms. Coleman, how did the Riverdale scheme fall apart?" "Someone started asking questions about insurance," Sarah explained. "The HOA's policy wouldn't cover commercial activities, and they were trying to hide the rental income. When the audit was scheduled, Victoria and her allies resigned suddenly. A car pulled up outside. It was Peter Rodriguez, the retired judge, arriving early as we'd planned. We quickly brought him up to speed on our findings. "This is more serious than simple overreach," Peter said gravely. "If they're planning unauthorized commercial activities using private properties, that could involve tax fraud, insurance fraud, and securities violations." Mark checked his watch. "It's time. Remember, let them talk. The more they say, the more evidence we gather. Laura, Daniel, you only speak if directly addressed. Jennifer will record any procedural violations, and I'll handle the legal challenges." We walked as a group to the community clubhouse. Despite the early hour and short notice, the parking lot was nearly full. Victoria's attempt to rush through changes with minimal attendance had backfired spectacularly. Inside, the usual neat rows of chairs had been arranged, but there was a tension in the air I'd never felt at previous HOA meetings. Victoria, Richard, and Barbara sat at the front table, looking surprised at the turnout. Barbara, I noticed, was fidgeting with her papers, not making eye contact with anyone. Victoria attempted to start the meeting with her usual artificial cheerfulness, but Peter... Rodriguez immediately stood up. "Point of order," he said firmly. "This meeting was called without proper notice under state law and HOA bylaws. Any actions taken today would be legally void." Victoria's smile tightened. "This is merely an informational session to clarify recent policy changes." "Then why does the agenda include 3 items marked for vote?" Jennifer asked, holding up the printed agenda they'd distributed. "We're trying to address community concerns efficiently," Richard interjected. Mark stood. "By violating proper notice requirements? By attempting to modify legally questionable policies through an improperly called meeting? Would you like me to enumerate the violations present just in this meeting's organization?" Victoria's composure cracked slightly. If certain parties would stop obstructing community progress. "Is commercial rental activity community progress?" Sarah Coleman called out from her seat, pen poised over her notebook. The room went silent. Victoria's face paled visibly. "I don't know what you're implying," she said stiffly. "Then let's be clear," Mark said, stepping forward. "We have evidence suggesting this community resource designation program is actually groundwork for unauthorized commercial activities. Would you like to address that?" Barbara Wilson suddenly stood up, her hands shaking. "I can't do this anymore," she announced. "Victoria, you promised this was about community enhancement, but I've seen the rental contracts you drafted. You're planning to list designated homes on short-term rental sites during the upcoming golf tournament." The room erupted in chaos. Victoria tried to call for order while Richard frantically gathered their papers, but Barbara wasn't finished. "I have copies," she said, her voice stronger now, "of everything. The rental agreements, the projected revenue splits, the shell company you created to handle the bookings. I should have spoken up sooner, but I'm speaking up now." Mark's hand touched my shoulder. "This is better than we could have hoped," he whispered, "a board member confession with documented evidence." Victoria finally got her microphone working. "This meeting is adjourned," she announced desperately. "Actually," Peter Rodriguez stood again, "since you called this meeting even improperly, you need a majority vote to adjourn. Shall we vote?" The look on Victoria's face was priceless. She knew she'd lost control of the meeting, of the narrative, of everything. Her carefully constructed scheme was unraveling in front of the entire community. "I move that we vote instead on suspending the entire board pending a full audit," Chris Parker called out. "Seconded!" Several voices rang out at once. What followed was the most productive impromptu HOA meeting I'd ever attended. Though no official actions could be taken due to the improper notice, the community organized an emergency election committee, scheduled a properly noticed special meeting, and collected signed statements from homeowners opposing the Community Resource Designation Program. As the meeting broke up, Barbara approached us with a thick folder. "Here's everything," she said, quietly. "I'm sorry I didn't come forward sooner. They were very convincing about it all being for the community's benefit." Sarah Coleman was already flipping through the documents, her eyes widening. "This is comprehensive," she said. "Would you be willing to go on record?" Barbara looked at Victoria and Richard, who were having what appeared to be a heated argument in the corner. "Yes," she said firmly. "It's time the truth came out." Mark was already on his phone, calling his office. "We need to file additional injunctions immediately. This goes way beyond HOA overreach now." Laura squeezed my hand. "Still think buying in an HOA neighborhood was a good idea?" she teased. I looked around at our neighbors, all coming together to fight this corruption, and smiled. "Actually, yes. Look what happens when a community stands together." The day after the explosive emergency meeting, our community mobilized with remarkable speed. Our front porch became an unofficial headquarters as neighbors streamed in with documents, testimonies, and previously undisclosed incidents involving Victoria's board. Susan Chen had organized a digital archive of everything we were collecting. "Look at this pattern," she said, pointing to her spreadsheet. Every time someone questioned the board's decisions in the past year, they suddenly started receiving violation notices for minor infractions. The Martinezes shared their story of how their garbage bin citation was just the beginning. After we complained about the new landscaping fees, they cited us for everything, David Martinez explained. The color of our mailbox, the height of our grass, even the placement of our holiday decorations, which weren't even up at the time. Laura was documenting everything, while I coordinated with Mark Stevens' office. Barbara Wilson had spent the morning with Mark's team, providing detailed testimony about Victoria's operations. The rental scheme was just part of it, Barbara revealed during a break. They were planning to create a network of community spaces throughout the neighborhood. Premium homes would be designated first, then they'd gradually expand the program. The rental income would go through a separate LLC, with the board members as silent partners. Just then, Chris Parker rushed over with his laptop. "You need to see this," he said urgently. "Victoria's trying to get ahead of the story." He pulled up the community Facebook page, where Victoria had posted a lengthy statement. "Dear valued Pine Valley Estates residents, recent misunderstandings about our community enhancement initiative have led to unnecessary concerns. The board has only ever acted in the community's best interests. Claims about unauthorized commercial activities are completely unfounded. Unfortunately, certain residents who have consistently resisted positive change are spreading misinformation for their own agenda." "She's trying to gaslight the entire neighborhood," Laura said incredulously. "Read the comments," Chris grinned. The community's response was overwhelming. Residents were sharing their own experiences with board overreach, posting copies of questionable violation notices and demanding Victoria's resignation. Peggy Walsh had even shared photos from her sister's Riverdale Heights neighborhood, showing the aftermath of Victoria's previous failed scheme. Sarah Coleman called, sounding excited. "My editor's giving me the green light for a full investigative piece. Barbara's documents show a clear pattern of financial manipulation beyond just the rental scheme. Can I come over for a detailed interview?" And as we coordinated meeting times with Sarah, Peter Rodriguez arrived with more reinforcements. "I've been talking with some colleagues from my judicial days," he said. "Victoria's previous HOA issues weren't limited to Riverdale Heights. There were similar attempts in at least 2 other communities." Mark Stevens joined us via video call, looking pleased. "The emergency injunction has been granted. They can't implement any new policies or collect any additional fees until after a full hearing. More importantly, the judge has ordered them to preserve all documents. They can't delete emails or shred anything now without facing serious legal consequences." "How's Barbara holding up?" I asked, concerned about our whistleblower. "She's been incredibly helpful," Mark assured us. "Her detailed records of board meetings, including conversations that weren't in the official minutes, are giving us a clear picture of how they planned this whole scheme." Susan had been digging deeper into the financial aspects. "I think I found where they were hiding the setup costs," she said. "Look at these maintenance budget allocations. They've been padding regular expenses to build a slush fund." Laura examined the numbers. "So that's why our landscaping fees doubled last quarter. They were funneling the extra money into their rental scheme setup." "Exactly," Susan nodded. "And guess who owns the new landscaping company they hired? A subsidiary of the same LLC they created for the rental program." The pieces were falling into place, revealing a complex web of financial manipulation and abuse of power. But Victoria wasn't going down without a fight. Around noon, Richard Anderson was seen going door to door with a petition of his own, claiming the recent opposition was just a vocal minority trying to block community improvements. Amy Parker texted me, "Richard just left, tried to convince us the rental program would increase our property values, said we were missing out on significant community revenue opportunities. Should I be recording these conversations?" "Absolutely," Mark replied when I forwarded him the message. "Every interaction helps build our case." By mid-afternoon, we had organized into focused teams. Susan led the financial investigation group, cross-referencing bank statements with Barbara's documents. Peter coordinated with other legal experts, building a comprehensive case against the board. The Parkers managed community outreach, ensuring everyone stayed informed and involved. Victoria made one last attempt to regain control, sending out an official HOA email announcing another emergency board meeting, this time giving proper notice, but scheduling it at the most inconvenient time possible, 7 a.m. on a Monday. "She still doesn't get it," Laura said, shaking her head as she read the email. "She thinks this is about catching people off guard or wearing them down. She doesn't understand that the community is awake now." She was right. Within hours of Victoria's email, neighbors had organized carpools to the meeting, arranged for coffee and breakfast to be provided, and even set up childcare for parents who needed to attend. The very tactics Victoria had used to discourage participation were now bringing people closer together. Sarah Coleman's preliminary article went live that evening. HOA power grab, residents fight back against unauthorized property seizure. The online comment section filled with similar stories from other communities, suggesting this was a more widespread issue than we'd initially thought. "This is bigger than just our neighborhood now," Mark said during our evening strategy call. "We're hearing from homeowners across the county who faced similar situations. Your case could set an important precedent for HOA oversight and reform." As day turned to evening, Laura and I sat on our front porch, the same porch Victoria had planned to turn into a community coffee spot, and marveled at how much had changed in just a few days. "Remember when our biggest HOA concern was whether they'd approve our garden planters?" Laura laughed. "Now look at us, leading a community revolution." "Not leading," I corrected her. "We're just part of it. Everyone's stepping up in their own way. That's what makes this different from Victoria's other schemes. She's never faced an entire community standing together like this." The following morning brought an unexpected twist to our battle. I was just finishing my coffee when Chris Parker came running across the street, waving a stack of papers. "They're trying to put liens on our properties," he exclaimed, spreading the documents on our kitchen counter. Everyone who spoke up at the meeting received one of these. I scanned the official-looking notice. According to the document, we were in violation of multiple HOA regulations and owed thousands in fines, late fees, and special assessments. The lien threat was Victoria's nuclear option, an attempt to force compliance through financial pressure. Laura immediately called Mark Stevens, putting him on speaker. "They can't do this, can they?" "They're getting desperate," Mark replied, sounding oddly pleased. "This is actually good for us. It shows a clear pattern of retaliation. How many homeowners received these notices?" "We're counting at least 12 so far," Chris said. "Everyone who publicly opposed them at the meeting." "Perfect," Mark said. "This kind of coordinated retaliation strengthens our case significantly. Don't worry about the liens. They're not valid without proper documentation of the violations, which they don't have. But keep those notices. They're excellent evidence." While Laura coordinated with other affected neighbors, I noticed something odd about the letterhead on the lien notices. The law firm listed wasn't our HOA's usual. Legal counsel, Susan Chen, who'd become our unofficial investigator, was already looking into it. The firm exists, but they specialize in corporate real estate, not HOA law. And guess who one of their major clients is? The same LLC Barbara found in the rental scheme documents. Peter Rodriguez arrived, looking concerned. We need to move. Faster. I've been reviewing the documents Barbara provided, and there's something troubling. Victoria's board hasn't just been planning rentals. They've been setting up a complex network of shell companies. I think the Community Resource Program is part of a larger real estate play. Mark asked to see the additional documents, and Peter shared his screen during our emergency video call. The pattern was disturbing. The board had been systematically laying groundwork for what appeared to be a neighborhood-wide property control scheme. Look at these zoning inquiry emails, Peter pointed out. They've been investigating mixed-use development options. If they gain control of enough properties through this community resource designation, they could potentially force through commercial rezoning, Mark finished. This just became much more serious. We needed official validation of our concerns, and fast. Mark suggested we take our evidence to the county commissioner's office. This goes beyond HOA governance now. It's about protecting residential zoning and property rights. Janet Cooper, the county inspector who arrived that afternoon, was a no-nonsense professional who took one look at our documentation and immediately started making calls. These shell companies weren't just created for rental income, she explained, pointing to various business filings. They're structured in a way that's typically used for major property development projects. Someone's planning something big, and they're trying to gain control of key properties without alerting the homeowners to their real intentions. Sarah Coleman arrived with her own bombshell. Her research had uncovered similar patterns in Victoria's previous communities, not just at Riverdale Heights, but in several other neighborhoods where she'd held board positions. It's like a traveling development scheme, Sarah explained. They get elected to HOA boards, implement these community resource programs, gain control of strategic properties, and then push through zoning changes. The homeowners don't realize what's happening until it's too late. Janet was particularly interested in the financial documentation Barbara had provided. These budget allocations for community enhancement, they're essentially creating a slush fund for property acquisition. It's clever, but it's not legal. The HOA's charter explicitly prohibits this kind of commercial activity. While we were meeting, more neighbors arrived with their own lien notices. Victoria's retaliation was backfiring spectacularly, bringing even more evidence to light. Each of these notices cites violations from our new Community Standards document, Susan noticed, comparing the papers. But according to Barbara's records, those standards were never properly ratified by the board. Mark was building a comprehensive legal response. We're not just fighting individual actions anymore. We're exposing a systematic attempt to subvert residential property rights. The judge needs to see the full scope of this scheme. Janet made several more calls, then turned to us with a serious expression. The county is opening a formal investigation. This goes beyond standard HOA oversight. There are potential violations of zoning laws, financial regulations, and property statutes. We'll need statements from everyone who received these retaliatory liens. The validation from official channels energized the community. Neighbors who had been hesitant to get involved were now stepping forward with their own stories and evidence. Remember when they tried to force everyone to use their approved contractor for roof repairs? David Martinez asked. Guess who owned the contracting company? Susan was already tracking the connection, another subsidiary of their development LLC. They've been building their control network for months, hiding it in plain sight. Smart. And called back with more news. The judge has expanded our injunction. The board is now prohibited from imposing any fines, liens, or new regulations until after a full hearing. More importantly, they can't modify any property designations or enter into any new contracts without court approval. Victoria's response was predictable. Another community-wide email attempting to dismiss the investigation as baseless. Accusations from disgruntled residents. But this time, she'd made a crucial mistake. She just violated the injunction, Mark said gleefully. The judge specifically barred them from sending unauthorized communications about the dispute. This email gives us grounds to request an emergency hearing. The official validation of our concerns had transformed the neighborhood's response. What started as a fight to protect one home from HOA overreach had exposed a sophisticated scheme to gradually take control of an entire community. We need to warn other neighborhoods, Laura suggested. If this is their pattern, they might be trying it elsewhere. Sarah was already on it. My editor's expanding the investigation to look at similar HOA takeover attempts across the county. Your story isn't unique, but your community's response is. Most neighborhoods don't catch on until it's too late. The morning of the emergency hearing arrived with an unexpected development. As I stepped outside to collect the newspaper, I found Victoria Thompson standing on my driveway with a man I'd never seen before. A polished-looking executive type in an expensive suit. "Daniel," Victoria said, her voice artificially pleasant. "I'd like you to meet Mr. James Harrison from Pinnacle Development Group. He has a proposition that might resolve all our misunderstandings." The man stepped forward, extending his hand. I didn't take it. "Mr. Miller," Harrison smiled, undeterred. "I understand there's been some tension in the community lately. My company specializes in neighborhood revitalization projects, and we believe we have a solution that could benefit everyone." "You mean the company that's connected to all those shell corporations you've been setting up?" I asked, watching their expressions carefully. Harrison's smile flickered slightly. "I see there's been some misinterpretation of standard business practices. We're prepared to make a very generous offer for your property, well above market value. This could all go away, and you could relocate to any neighborhood you choose." Before I could respond, Laura appeared at the door. "The only thing going away," she said firmly, "is your attempt to take over our community. Mark Stevens is on his way with the county prosecutor's office. Would you like to wait and explain your standard business practices to them?" Victoria and Harrison retreated quickly to a waiting luxury SUV. As they drove away, I noticed Sarah Coleman parked down the street, photographing the entire interaction. "Perfect timing," she called out, walking over. "I've been researching Pinnacle Development Group. You won't believe what I found." Inside, our kitchen had become a war room once again. Sarah spread out her research while we waited for Mark to arrive. "Pinnacle's been involved in similar situations in 3 other counties," she explained. "They find neighborhoods with strategic location value, install cooperative HOA boards, and gradually gain control of key properties. Once they have enough leverage, they push through rezoning for commercial development." Laura was reviewing the documents. "And the homeowners? Nerd, forced out through a combination of rising fees, arbitrary violations, and property devaluation," Sarah replied. "Those who don't sell voluntarily eventually can't afford to stay. The community resource designation is just their newest tactic." Mark arrived with Janet Cooper from the county inspector's office and a serious-looking woman he introduced as Catherine Morris from the district attorney's office. "We need to document everything about this morning's interaction," Catherine said, opening her briefcase. "This kind of direct contact violates multiple provisions of the injunction." Janet was particularly interested in Pinnacle's involvement. "This connects some troubling dots. We've been investigating similar patterns in other neighborhoods, but couldn't prove the coordination. Now we have a direct link." As they took our statements, neighbors began arriving for our planned pre-hearing strategy session. The community room we'd rented at the local library quickly filled beyond capacity. Peter Rodriguez started the meeting. Today's hearing is crucial. The judge will decide whether to extend the injunction and potentially remove the current board. But more importantly, this is our chance to expose the larger scheme. Mark laid out our strategy. We have three main objectives. First, demonstrate the board's pattern of abuse and retaliation. Second, expose the unauthorized commercial planning behind the community resource program. Third, reveal Pinnacle's involvement and their history of similar takeover attempts. Barbara Wilson had brought additional documents, emails between Victoria and Pinnacle Development Group dating back months before she even joined our HOA board. They'd been planning this for over a year, Barbara explained. Victoria wasn't elected by accident. She was placed here specifically to implement their acquisition strategy. Susan Chen projected her findings onto the wall. Look at the pattern. First, they increase fees and create new violation categories. Then they target specific properties for their community resource program. Meanwhile, they're quietly setting up the corporate structure for eventual commercial development. The hearing room was packed when we arrived at the courthouse. Victoria and her board sat at one table with their lawyers, while James Harrison and several Pinnacle executives occupied the row behind them. Mark presented our case, methodically building a compelling narrative of corruption and conspiracy. He introduced evidence of the retaliatory liens, Barbara's documented proof of the unauthorized commercial planning, and the pattern of similar schemes in other communities. When Victoria took the stand, her carefully crafted image cracked under questioning. "Ms. Thompson," Mark began, "can you explain why you contacted Mr. Miller this morning in direct violation of the court's injunction?" "Tim, I was merely trying to facilitate a mutually beneficial resolution," she replied stiffly, "by connecting him with Pinnacle Development Group, the same company that's linked to your network of shell corporations." Victoria's composure slipped. "Those are standard business entities for community development." "Are they the same entities you used in Riverdale Heights before resigning amid allegations of financial misconduct?" The judge leaned forward, clearly interested. Victoria glanced nervously at Harrison before responding. I was merely exploring options for community enhancement." Mark produced the emails Barbara had provided. "These messages suggest you were recruited specifically to implement Pinnacle's acquisition strategy. Is that correct?" Victoria's lawyer jumped up to object, but the damage was done. The judge's expression had turned thunderous. After several more hours of testimony, including statements from affected neighbors and expert analysis of the financial documents, the judge made his ruling. "This court has seen clear evidence of a coordinated attempt to subvert homeowner rights for commercial gain," he declared. "The temporary injunction is hereby extended and expanded. Furthermore, I am ordering the immediate removal of the current board and appointing a court supervisor to oversee new elections." But he wasn't finished. "Additionally, I'm referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for potential criminal investigation into fraud and conspiracy charges. The attempt to use HOA authority as a vehicle for commercial property acquisition is a serious abuse of power that this court cannot ignore. The victory was comprehensive, but we knew our fight wasn't over. As we left the courthouse, Harrison caught up with me. "This isn't finished, Miller," he said quietly. "Communities evolve. Development is inevitable. You're just delaying the inevitable." "No," I replied, watching our neighbors celebrate on the courthouse steps. "We're protecting our homes and our community, and we're exposing your playbook so other neighborhoods can do the same." The aftermath of the court hearing brought both victory and new challenges. While Victoria and her board had been removed, we now faced the complex task of rebuilding our community's HOA from the ground up. The court-appointed supervisor, Michelle Ramirez, called an emergency community meeting to assess the situation. The first priority, Michelle explained to the packed community center, is to conduct a complete audit of the HOA's finances and operations. We need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. The preliminary findings were worse than we'd imagined. Susan Chen, who'd been asked to assist with the financial review due to her accounting background, shared the disturbing details. They didn't just misappropriate funds, she reported, pointing to her spreadsheets. They created an entire shadow financial system. Community fees were being channeled through multiple shell companies before reaching their final destinations. Some of these transfers date back to before Victoria even joined the board. Mark Stevens, joining us via video call, was particularly concerned about one discovery. We found evidence that they were preparing to place liens on over 30 properties, all strategically located for potential commercial development. They were planning to force foreclosures if homeowners couldn't pay their artificially inflated fines. The revelation sent shockwaves through the community. David Martinez stood up, visibly angry. So those violation notices weren't just harassment. They were part of a calculated plan to take our homes. Exactly, Michelle confirmed. But here's where it gets interesting. The court order doesn't just stop their current actions. It gives us grounds to investigate every decision made during Victoria's tenure. We can potentially reverse any unjust fines or fees they imposed. Laura had been working with Barbara Wilson to reconstruct the board's secret meetings. "Look at this pattern," she said, displaying a timeline on the projector. Every time Pinnacle Development acquired property in other neighborhoods, it was preceded by similar HOA takeover attempts. They've been perfecting this strategy for years. Sarah Coleman's latest article had exposed Pinnacle's broader operations, leading to investigations in multiple counties. Her phone buzzed with a text during our meeting. "Breaking news," she announced. "The State Attorney General's office is opening a formal investigation into Pinnacle Development Group. They're looking into potential RICO violations. This could be part of a much larger organized scheme." The pressure points we'd established were starting to show results, but we weren't prepared for what happened next. Richard Anderson, Victoria's former right-hand man, arrived unannounced at the meeting. "I want to make a statement," he said, his usual arrogance replaced by visible nervousness. "And I've brought documents. Everything I know about Pinnacle's operations and their network of compromised HOA boards." The room fell silent as Richard explained how Pinnacle recruited and planted board members in targeted communities. They looked for neighborhoods with aging infrastructure, knowing the promise of development funds would appeal to struggling HOAs. Victoria wasn't the mastermind, he revealed. She was just one of many operatives. Pinnacle has people placed in HOA boards across the state. They call it their Community Integration Program. It's a systematic plan to gain control of prime real estate through HOA manipulation. Michelle immediately called Mark, putting him on speakerphone. "This could be crucial for the state." "Investigation," Mark said. "Mr. Anderson, are you willing to make an official statement to the Attorney General's office?" Richard nodded. "I have names, dates, bank accounts, everything. I saw what happened to Victoria. I don't want to go down with this ship." While Richard's revelation was a breakthrough, it also raised alarming questions about how many other communities might be at risk. Peter Rodriguez suggested creating a task force to share our findings and strategies with other neighborhoods. "We need to document everything we've learned," he said. "How we spotted the signs, how we organized resistance, how we built our legal case. Other communities need this information." Chris and Amy Parker had already started a website, Protect Our Neighborhoods. a resource for communities facing similar threats. We've already received messages from HOA members in 3 other counties, Amy reported. They're seeing the same patterns we experienced. The pressure was building on multiple fronts. 1. Legal pressure, the state investigation into Pinnacle was expanding, with our case providing the blueprint for prosecutors. 2. Financial pressure. The audit was uncovering a trail of irregular transactions, leading to freeze orders on multiple accounts. 3. Public pressure. Sarah's articles had sparked national interest in HOA abuse, bringing unwanted attention to Pinnacle's operations. 4. Community pressure. Other neighborhoods were beginning to scrutinize their HOA boards, looking for signs of similar infiltration. James Harrison made one last attempt to contain the situation. He requested a meeting with the community's interim leadership committee, offering to resolve all issues amicably. Pinnacle is prepared to compensate the community generously, he proposed, sliding a document across the table, in exchange for certain discretionary considerations. Michelle picked up the document and smiled. Mr. Harrison, are you attempting to bribe a court-appointed supervisor? Because that's what this looks like to me. Harrison's facade cracked slightly. This is a legitimate business proposal, which I'm obligated to report to the court, Michelle interrupted. Would you like to revise your statement for the record? He left quickly after that, but his attempted buy-off only added to our evidence pile. Mark was particularly pleased. They're running scared now. This kind of desperate move shows we're close to something big. The community meeting continued late into the evening as we planned our next steps. We needed to support the state investigation with our documentation, help other communities identify and resist similar takeover attempts, rebuild our own HOA with proper oversight and transparency, create lasting protections against future manipulation attempts. The important thing, Peter reminded us, is that we're not just fixing our community. We're creating a model for others to follow. Every HOA board that gets exposed, every development scheme that gets blocked, makes it harder for them to operate. As I looked around the room at my neighbors, now partners in this larger fight, I realized how far we'd come from that morning when Victoria tried to claim my home as a community resource. We'd not only saved our neighborhood, but had helped expose a systematic assault on community governance. The weeks following Richard Anderson's confession marked a turning point in our battle. The State Attorney General's investigation into Pinnacle Development Group was moving at an unprecedented pace, fueled by the mountain of evidence we'd uncovered. One morning, as Laura and I were having coffee on our front porch, now safely and permanently our own, we saw a fleet of official vehicles pull up outside Victoria's house. FBI agents and state investigators spent hours removing boxes of documents and digital devices. Sarah Coleman arrived shortly after, her reporter's instincts having tipped her off to the raid. They're executing similar warrants at Pinnacle's offices and the homes of several other HOA board members across the state, she informed us. Your case broke the dam. Inside, our phones were buzzing with messages from neighbors sharing news updates. The story had gone national, with major networks picking up Sarah's reporting on the systematic abuse of HOA authority for commercial gain. Mark Stevens called with the details we'd been waiting for. The Attorney General is announcing formal charges today, he said, his voice triumphant. Wire fraud, racketeering, conspiracy. They're treating this as an organized criminal enterprise. Victoria and James Harrison are named as co-conspirators, along with board members from 6 other communities. But the biggest victory came from an unexpected source. Barbara Wilson had been working with state legislators to draft new HOA oversight regulations. She'd transformed from a reluctant whistleblower into a passionate advocate for homeowner rights. The Wilson Act is gaining bipartisan support, she explained during our community meeting. It would require strict transparency in HOA operations, prohibit commercial development schemes disguised as community improvements, and establish clear procedures for challenging board decisions. Michelle Ramirez, our court-appointed supervisor, had more immediate good news. "The audit is complete," she announced. "We've identified every improper fee, fine, and assessment imposed under Victoria's board. All affected homeowners will receive full refunds, plus interest." The Martinezes were the first to receive their refund check. "It's not just about the money," David said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's about justice. They tried to bully us, to make us feel powerless in our own home. Never again." Chris and Amy Parker's Protect Our Neighborhoods website had become a hub for communities facing similar threats. They developed a comprehensive guide for spotting warning signs of HOA infiltration. 1. Sudden board leadership changes. 2. Rapid introduction of new fees and regulations. 3. Targeting of specific properties for community programs. 4. Creation of complex financial structures. 5. Attempts to gain control of private property through rule changes. "We're getting calls from across the country," Amy reported. "Communities are organizing, sharing information, standing up to corrupt boards. What happened here is becoming a blueprint for resistance." Susan Chen had transformed our financial documentation into a forensic accounting toolkit that other communities could use. "Follow the money," she advised during a webinar for concerned homeowners. "These schemes leave a paper trail if you know where to look." Peter Rodriguez was working with legal experts to create standardized responses to common HOA overreach tactics. "The key is rapid response," he explained. "The longer these schemes operate, the harder they are to dismantle. Communities need to be prepared to challenge suspicious actions immediately." Our neighborhood was healing, but we weren't just returning to normal. We were building something better. The interim HOA board, elected under Michelle's supervision, established new principles of transparency and accountability. All meetings were recorded and live-streamed. Financial records were publicly accessible. Board decisions required community input. Property rights were explicitly protected. Commercial activities were strictly regulated. Laura had taken a leadership role in community outreach, organizing workshops to help residents understand their rights and responsibilities. "Knowledge is power," she often said. "What happened to us could have been prevented if we'd known what to look for." The transformation in our community was remarkable. Neighbors who had once avoided HOA matters were now actively engaged in governance. The fear and suspicion Victoria had cultivated had been replaced by a spirit of cooperation and mutual support. One evening, as we gathered for a community celebration in the park, a real community event, not a cover for commercial schemes, I found myself talking with Peggy Walsh. "You know," she said, watching children play on the newly renovated a playground. "I've lived here for 20 years. There were times under Victoria's board when I thought about moving. The stress, the constant fear of violations. But look at us now. We're stronger than ever." She was right. Our fight had not only exposed corruption, but had shown what a community could achieve when it united against injustice. The community resource that Victoria had tried to steal wasn't my home. It was the spirit of resistance and solidarity she had unwittingly awakened. Mark called with one final piece of news. "The court has issued its final ruling," he announced. "Not only are all of Victoria's board's actions permanently voided, but they've established a legal precedent that will make it harder for similar schemes to operate anywhere in the state." The ruling specifically cited our community's response as a model for challenging HOA abuse. The coordinated efforts of informed homeowners, working within legal frameworks and supported by proper documentation, demonstrated the effective limits of HOA authority and the paramount importance of protecting individual property rights. Sarah's final article on our case ended with a quote from Barbara Wilson. What happened in Pine Valley Estates wasn't just about stopping one corrupt board or exposing one development scheme. It was about reclaiming the true meaning of community. Neighbors standing together, protecting each other's rights, building something that can't be bought or stolen. As I stood in my driveway that evening, the same driveway where Victoria had tried to install her lockbox, where Harrison had attempted his buy-off, where our fight had begun, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction. We hadn't just saved our homes. We'd created a legacy that would protect countless other communities. 1 year after Victoria Thompson's failed attempt to seize control of our homes, I stood in front of a packed auditorium at the National Homeowners' Rights Conference. Laura squeezed my hand as I prepared to share our story with hundreds of community leaders from across the country. It started with a simple notice on my door, I began, but it revealed a systematic attempt to undermine homeowner rights nationwide. Today, I want to share not just what happened, but what we learned and how communities everywhere can protect themselves. The changes our fight had sparked went far beyond Pine Valley Estates. The Wilson Act, named after Barbara's courageous whistleblowing, had been adopted in 12 states, with more following suit. Its provisions had become a model for HOA reform: mandatory financial transparency, strict limits on board authority, protected property rights, clear appeals processes, criminal penalties for abuse of power. Sarah Coleman's investigative reporting had earned her a national award and sparked a series of exposés on HOA corruption across the country. She'd uncovered similar schemes in dozens of communities, leading to more investigations and reforms. The Pine Valley Estates case cracked open a nationwide problem, she told me during a break at the conference. Communities everywhere are now scrutinizing their HOA boards, asking questions they never thought to ask before. Back home, our neighborhood had become a model of effective community governance. The new HOA board, elected with full community participation, operated with unprecedented transparency. Every meeting was streamed live, every decision documented and explained. Susan Chen had developed her forensic accounting toolkit into a comprehensive program now used by HOA auditors nationwide. Follow the money became her mantra as she trained other communities to spot financial red flags. It's not just about catching bad actors, she explained during her workshop session. It's about preventing abuse through systematic oversight. When board members know they're being watched, they're less likely to attempt manipulation. The Parkers Protect Our Neighborhoods website had evolved into a national resource network, connecting communities facing similar challenges. Their early warning system had already helped several neighborhoods identify and stop attempted takeover schemes before they could take root. What happened in Pine Valley Estates was just the tip of the iceberg, Chris shared during a panel discussion. But now, communities have the tools and knowledge to fight back. The playbook for corruption has been exposed. Peter Rodriguez's legal framework had become standard reference material for property rights attorneys. The precedents established, in our case, have made it easier for other communities to challenge HOA overreach, he explained. Courts now recognize these schemes for what they are: organized attempts to subvert property rights. Victoria Thompson and James Harrison had faced justice. Their guilty pleas in the federal case had exposed the full scope of Pinnacle's operations. The investigation had uncovered similar schemes in over 30 communities, leading to a wave of criminal charges and civil suits. Barbara Wilson, once a reluctant participant in their schemes, had become a leading voice for HOA reform. Her testimony before state legislatures had been instrumental in passing new oversight laws. The system only worked for the corrupt because Good people stayed silent, she told the conference audience. Breaking that silence was the hardest and most important thing I've ever done. Our own community had healed and grown stronger. The fear and suspicion that marked Victoria's reign had been replaced by genuine cooperation and engagement. Monthly community meetings, once dreaded obligations, became forums for positive change and connection. Laura had started a mentorship program helping other communities organize effective resistance to HOA abuse. The key is building networks before you need them, she advised. When homeowners know and trust each other, it's harder for corrupt boards to divide and conquer. The Martinezes, who had faced constant harassment under Victoria's board, now led the Community Outreach Committee. We learned that speaking up isn't just a right, it's a responsibility, David said. Every voice matters in protecting our communities. Even Peggy Walsh, our elderly neighbor who had witnessed the community's transformation, had found a new purpose. She documented our story in a detailed chronicle that became required reading for new residents. History repeats itself only when we forget, she reminded us. Our community's story needs to be remembered so it never happens again. The impact rippled beyond HOA governance. Our fight had exposed broader issues of property rights and community empowerment. State legislators were now examining how development companies influenced local governance, leading to stricter oversight and transparency requirements. Mark Stevens had expanded his practice to focus on community rights cases. What happened in Pine Valley Estates created a template for effective resistance, he explained. Communities now know they don't have to face these battles alone. The court-appointed supervisor, Michelle Ramirez, had developed new guidelines for HOA oversight that were being adopted nationwide. The key is prevention, she emphasized. Strong governance structures and engaged communities make it harder for corrupt influences to take root. As I concluded my conference speech, I shared the most important lesson from our experience. The real strength of a community isn't in its rules or regulations, it's in its people. When we stand together, when we refuse to be intimidated, when we fight for what's right, we can overcome any attempt to take what's ours. The applause that followed wasn't just for our victory. It was for every community that had found inspiration in our story, every homeowner who had discovered their voice, every neighborhood that had reclaimed its power. Back home, standing in my driveway, still mine, forever mine, I reflected on how far we'd come. Victoria's attempt to declare my home a community resource had backfired spectacularly. Instead, she had helped create something far more valuable, a true community resource of knowledge, solidarity, and empowerment that would protect homeowners for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.